Sometimes people make a war, don't know what it's for.
Okay, this is the last anti-war movie I'll review for a while. The fact that I reviewed Scarman, Slaughterhouse-5, and now Welcome Home Soldier Boys, all in a short amount of time, is a coincidence, though I do often like to find connecting themes in the films I review. This 1971 film, directed by Richard Compton, was one of the first to address the psychological effects of the Vietnam War on returning veterans and their treatment by the American public, and follows 4 weary veteran buddies as they travel to California together. The 4 veterans, having returned from a very unpopular war, are shunned and treated with disdain by the locals they meet, which reflects the differing perceptions of the Vietnam War and earlier 20th century wars. World Wars I and II were undeniably harsh and grueling affairs, but they were relatively short and framed in unambiguous black-and-white terms of America fighting against a clear threat to freedom, democracy, and the Western way of life. But the Vietnam War lasted for almost 20 years, and the general public couldn't get behind it in the same way they could with World War II. The war was essentially in a stalemate by 1968, and the Americans and North Vietnamese couldn't get ahead of each other. The Truman Doctrine informed a significant amount of U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War, as it set up America's commitment to preventing the spread of communism, but what exactly did the American people stand to gain from this, especially since the democratic South Vietnamese government under Diem, which America sought to protect, was so corrupt? As such, the U.S. government was thought to be wasting time, money, and lives on a seemingly endless and futile war with little benefit. After all, as there was no formal declaration of war on North Vietnam, American soldiers weren't fighting for their country, and were being killed or traumatized by the thousands for arguably nothing. There's only so long you can help out with someone else's situation before you need to look out for yourself, and the war in Vietnam eventually became too draining and costly for America to justifiably continue with. On top of that, the atrocities committed by both sides were reported and disseminated much more quickly through television. All of this contributed to the public view of the Vietnam War as a fool's errand, and returning veterans were treated as blame figures for this debacle. This condemnation is shown in the grumbling bar patrons, Danny's dismissive old friend, the obstinate auto mechanic, and the small-town sheriff who is nice to their faces and yet, as a thinly veiled insult, lets them sleep in the jailhouse and apparently robbed them of most of their money. But the film places greater emphasis on how the war affected its veteran characters. Danny's parents are uneasy about the friends he brought along for dinner, unaware that they are inseparable due to the close brotherly camaraderie brought on by war. The 4 veterans want to run a cattle ranch together in California and fully accept the very hard work this will require because they had grown accustomed to long, hard, dirty work during their time in Vietnam. Danny's parents don't realize this, as they rather flippantly dismiss the cattle ranch idea. The veterans watch a basketball game at one point, but the ritualistic dances of the cheerleaders, the brass band tune, and the two-sided conflict in the game somehow seem hollow in a non-military context. Finally, one of the veterans impassively tells a hooker that he killed over 130 people. His lack of concern, remorse, or any real emotion indicates that he and his friends have been desensitized and numbed to violence by their time in Vietnam. There is a strong sense throughout the film of the veteran characters being out of touch with the world, and the world having rejected them. These subtle, contemplative moments are executed well, but they are dispersed too thinly throughout the sluggish narrative. The interesting commentary in the film is broken up by long, dull stretches and many plot threads that don't really go anywhere, such as the hitchhiker and the $50 win in the cafe. These wide gaps in the plot dilute the effect of the veterans' sanity slowly wearing down and the impact of them finally snapping and shooting up a town, shocking though it still is. But, I thought to myself, this pacing may have been deliberate, as it might accurately represent the experiences of a soldier in Vietnam, long periods of waiting and inactivity, punctuated by moments of action and meaning. If this is the case, then I understand what the filmmakers were going for with the pacing, even though I don't think it makes for a satisfying experience. That's essentially why I chose to review this film after I bought it for my dad and we watched it a few days ago. Welcome Home Soldier Boys offers an exercise in objectivity. I think that the pacing in this film is very poor, as it hinders our ability to stay invested in the characters and weakens the impact of the social commentary, but if this slow, disjointed pacing was intended for the thematic purpose above of drawing us further into the mind of a soldier, then does it objectively succeed? Maybe, although you could make a case just as sound for the pacing being objectively bad on a narrative and storytelling level for the reasons explained before. In any kind of criticism, objectivity, as opposed to subjectivity, involves assessing something without any influence from your personal tastes, bias, and opinions. Objectivity is vital in science, as we mustn't let feelings distort research, evidence, and the truths science is supposed to reveal. But objectivity is hard, as we are naturally emotional, opinionated creatures. It's often difficult to separate our personal opinions and perspectives from a given piece of media, and I don't think we necessarily should. Even assuming it's possible, a completely objective review would be very dry and impersonal. It would even, to an extent, defeat the purpose of a film review, as a review is supposed to explain and argue why the critic likes or dislikes a film, and whether other people would enjoy it. The viewer's interpretation is just as important as the author's intent, and an artist makes art for society as much as for him or herself. While we should take into account the aims and visions of the artist, we are more than entitled to discuss the result and question whether they did a bad job. As I've said before, objectivity is difficult, and some of us have braved this minefield before because of confused Matthew's review of 2001: A Space Odyssey, which upset many people, including myself. But can a film truly be objectively good or objectively bad? Brandon Lee Tenney of FirstShowing.net declared that a film can be considered objectively good if its story can be understood and if all of its elements work together to achieve a balance. Tenney cites Casablanca and Memento as two films that fit these criteria as objectively good. This is a simple yet very clever hypothesis, but depending on how you look at movies, so few or so many movies could qualify as objectively good that the term would become meaningless. And those words, depending on how you look, cast further doubt on Tenney's theory, as personal attitudes and preferences may still, even unconsciously, alter our anatomical dissection of a film to see if it's balanced and comprehensible. Also, what about films that don't try to have a story that can be understood, such as Eraserhead and Un Chien Andalou? Taking Tenney's theory, are we to conclude that these sorts of films can never be objectively good? This film demonstrates that I can see the objective validity, and on some level the success, of a technique like Welcome Home Soldier Boy's pacing, but it also illustrates what I've been saying about how the author's intent does not automatically negate a given feature's bad quality. Or, something can be objectively good, but not so good on a subjective level. Ultimately, objectivity is almost impossible and not very useful in film criticism. Now that this little essay is over, let's return to the film itself. Welcome Home Soldier Boys is a worthwhile watch for its strikingly violent, nihilistic ending and its very compelling, brave social commentary on a war that was still going at the time, but the thinly written characters comprising half of the lead cast and the sparse, dull, though thematically appropriate pacing make it rather tedious and sapid of impact. Welcome Home Soldier Boys earns 3 stars out of 5. Thanks for watching. Cheers.